Come, spellweavers, reavers, rogues, and men-at-arms, and answer the call of adventure. Pick up your sword, your axe, your spellbook, your bow, your rulebook, and your dice, and join the forces of good in their eternal fight against vile monsters, conspiring min-maxers, horny bards, and blood-soaked murder hobos. Discover the treasure trove of role-playing games here on Rollin Bones. My name is Ryan Howard, and I shall be your guide. Good evening, Boneheads, and welcome back to Rollin' Bones with Ryan Howard, where we are making old school young again. I'm your host and king of the Boneheads, Ryan Howard. I am the RNOSR, and joining me this evening is a man who has been on here several times. He is I believe you now have the most appearances of any guest on Rollin' Bones, and I feel like every time you come on here, you break your own record, but... without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Levi Combs from Planet X Games. Welcome back.
Hey, man. How are you?
I am doing great. How are you?
I'm good, dude.
Absolutely. It's either you or Tim Mathias from Knights and Nerds, and I feel like you guys are always like right there next to each other.
I'm coming for the crown, Tim.
Absolutely. Although Luau Lu is making a fast bid for similar status, and I feel like John McGuire is also trying to horn in on your action there. So,
well, you just named two dudes that I absolutely love. John, I talk to John every single day, and Lou, man, I don't know that there's anybody else in RPGs except for maybe Dan Yodano.
Yep.
On Twitter.
I love
Between those two guys, they're the most enthusiastic people for RPGs. Their enthusiasm for games is contagious. So I like to love being around both those dudes.
Mm-hmm. I need to bring Dano on just for a Dragonlance specific show.
Yeah, yeah. Dude, at Gamehole, I'd see him walk by and he would just stop. And in the middle of the entire hall, he would just go, "I love Dungeons and Dragons," and everybody would just clap or laugh. His enthusiasm was just infectious. It was awesome to have him around.
Absolutely. Crafty, you mentioned one of these days you'll get out to a con and shake hands. You should come to North Texas this year if you can make it.
Yes, please. I will leave a seat open in any game you want to. Come to North Texas. Mm-hmm. You have an auto.
Yeah, at this point, I've got tons of people. When I first came to North Texas, I had tons of people I wanted to meet. Now I have even more people that I need to meet because, last time I was there, I only kind of sort of ran into Jeff Talanian. It was before he came on here. So I'll need to have an actual conversation with Jeff. Eric Tenkar, I also ran into, but again, he hadn't been on the show before. So I'll need to have a conversation with Tenkar. And, I think there's several other people who will be there that have been on the show that I just haven't had the chance to talk to yet.
Yeah, all of those are great dudes. The beauty of that con really is that it's not like any other con. The closest in I don't know, vibe or just how friendly everyone is ShireCon. And then on a much larger scale, and I don't know how he makes it work, hard work, I guess, but is Gamehole. Gamehole is another one of those extremely welcoming cons where, nobody has a chip on their shoulder and nobody's walking around like there's somebody. It's just a very cool con. And, you can get in any kind of game you want, Yeah,
absolutely. Now we'll circle back around to cons because, registration for North Texas Games is going to be happening sometime soon. But for tonight, we actually have a topic to discuss, and that is the topic of Weird Fantasy versus Gonzo. And I want to preface this by saying I have an understanding of what weird fantasy is. Weird fantasy is a very important concept when it comes to what we do here because it is the almost the primordial soup of role-playing games. But Gonzo is a weird concept when applied to things other than Hunter S. Thompson. It's like the old joke about pornography. You can't explain it, but you know it when you see it.
It's a very good analogy.
So I'll let you get into that, but I guess to kind of begin things, what was your first encounter with weird fantasy?
So my easily my very first encounter with weird fantasy was Appendix N in the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide. But I didn't know that it was Appendix N at the time. My mom was an avid science fiction reader, and then when the science fiction book club came along, you would always see it like in the back of like Omni magazine, or sometimes in the back of like I don't know, like, a family magazine or a TV guide or something like that. You would see these ads for the science fiction book club. And at first, like, the offerings were kind of bland, and she was just kind of going through and like rereading stuff that she had read, earlier in her life. But then they broadened their spectrum to include fantasy, and I was kind of just coming up on that like 9, 10, 11-year-old, segment of my life to where I was really into reading basically anything I get my hands on. I was reading a lot of my mom's like old science fiction, like like Robert Heinlein or Asimov or Joe Haldeman or things like that. Harry Harrison's Stainless Steel Rat and things like that. But when the fantasy stuff became available, I had already liked like Thundar the Barbarian. I had liked a little bit of Dungeons and Dragons, and had been way into the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon, and just kind of liked like He-Man and Conan and the Savage Sword of Conan and things like that. So when these books showed up on these fantasy books showed up on the science fiction book club, I was like, Mom, can I get a membership? That was like the first time, like most kids, they sign up for like the 12 tapes for a penny thing. Science fiction book club instead. So right off the bat, I got like the Elric series and the Chronicles of Amber and the Jack Vance stuff and just all that kind of was it Dilvish the Damned and Shadow Jack and all these really strange. It wasn't The Hobbit. It wasn't which I had already kind of read and absorbed and enjoyed. This was kind of like all kind of off the rails, sort of like you didn't really know what was going to happen, like especially with Elric. He's such an anti-hero. And then you get into like the Chronicles of Amber, where you've got all these royal princes and princesses, and they're all maneuvering against each other, and they can do things like walk in shadow, and they're walking the pattern, and they're all this crazy stuff. These really interesting ideas, but yeah, I didn't know it was Appendix N, but that was my appendix. And then of course Lovecraft, that was another big piece of the weird fantasy portion. I mean, he has his supernatural horror stuff, but he's got a lot of like really kind of dreamlike weird stuff, like was it the Silver Key or what is it, Unknown Kadath and all that stuff, like so really stories. But yeah, Appendix N, just didn't know it was Appendix N.
Yeah. Yeah, I think my first encounter with it, my introduction to fantasy was very conventional. It was the Lord of the Rings movies, because I'm 27. So that was my first exposure to fantasy. And then like I read the Aragon series, which you can laugh at me for that all you want. When I was in 6th grade, Aragon was the shit.
Aragon had been around when I was in 6th grade. I would have read every word.
Yeah. But I mean, like when it comes to weird fantasy, my first exposure was I was in Barnes & Noble. I had a Barnes & Noble gift card, and they've got those like leather-bound complete works of complete Sherlock Holmes, leather-bound classics that they have at every single Barnes and Noble throughout the country. They had a complete works of H.P. Lovecraft. And I knew vaguely about like the idea of what Cthulhu was. I knew, there's this whole Lovecraft mythos. And my thought was, if I am to consider myself a nerd, I have to have this book on my bookshelf. So I bought the complete works of H.P. Lovecraft, and I started reading them, and that was my kind of baptism by fire into
Oh, wow.
weird fantasy. Was reading Lovecraft.
Oh man, that is cool. And you were how old? 12?
I was not 12 when I read H.P. Lovecraft. I was like 16.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, because I was right around. I want to say I was much younger when I encountered Lovecraft, but it was initially through the deities and demigods book because that was the coolest section of the book. It had all the Cthulhu gods or old ones that were drawn by Errol Otis.
Yep.
So I was like, "What are these things? Like this guy's got tentacles all over his face. This guy, you even say his name, like demons show up and carry you away. Like this is crazy."
Mm-hmm.
And then that, of course, made me go out and find the first paperback I could find that had Lovecraft's name in it,
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, Science Fiction Book Club. So,
yeah, and what's weird about kind of my weird fantasy pedigree, as people who tune into the show know, I didn't know that I was related to Robert E. Howard until like 2 years ago. So
so cool.
it wasn't even a thought in my mind to pick up the Conan the Barbarian books. I knew I would have loved them when I was 16 just from reading them now. But, I mean, to me, Conan was Arnold Schwarzenegger at that point.
Right.
So,
No, it still is to a lot of folks, And there's nothing wrong with that. Those movies are classics. I mean, who doesn't want to watch, Conan the Barbarian and, HD, sitting back with the sound turned all the way up so you can hear that awesome score. I mean, all those people who got to go see it in the theaters here recently, I guess it was the 40th anniversary.
Yep.
Like, man, what an experience. What a nostalgic experience, Perfect.
But yeah, it's interesting that you mention all the tentacles, because when I looked it up, like on Wikipedia, just to get a little bit of a primer on how do you define weird fantasy, one of the first things it mentions is the notion that what differentiates it between or from like regular gothic horror or regular fantasy is tentacles. Monsters with tentacles don't really appear in conventional fantasy, I guess with the exception of the giant squid in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But that's one of the main things that it mentions.
Yeah, there's the monster outside the door at the Dwarven Caverns and Fellowship of the Ring. There's that thing. I don't know that I would go with that. I don't know. Maybe I haven't given it much thought, but like that seems like a weird line to draw between fantasy and weird fantasy. Is the inclusion of tentacles? That sounds more like it has like Japanese stuff. Sounds like more that would be the line between that. So. I don't know. When I think of like what is weird fantasy, I'm like, okay, like so fantasy is like Tolkien, that's your basic kind of fantasy, or Terry Brooks or somebody like that. That's fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
But then I think of like weird fantasy. I'm thinking of like Michael Moorcock, Roger Zelazny, H.P. Lovecraft, and almost not even really Robert E. Howard. I mean, there's definitely some weird fantasy aspects of that, but I think that's more sword and sorcery.
Mm-hmm.
As not so much weird, like more of what like Jeff Talanian does with Astonishing Sorcerers of Hyperborea. Like it's very, very almost pitch perfect sword and sorcery vibe to that. Although that it does have its weird fantasy moments, of course, because he's influenced by a lot of the same things that influence a lot of us, of a certain age.
But yeah, I mean, to me, kind of the differentiating factor between traditional fantasy and weird fantasy is there are a lot of things that are just off the table in traditional fantasy. Traditional fantasy it's of the Tolkien lineage. It's kind of well-built, established worlds, kingdoms and stuff like that. You're never going to be exploring Middle Earth and find a 1,000-year-old crashed UFO. But in weird fantasy, of course you would.
That's a very good point. Yeah, so like you're talking to like Tolkien and things like that, like King of Elfland's daughter, or like even like the King Arthur myths and things like that. It's very, very fantasy. You know, you have your witches, you have your wizards. There's elves have pointy ears and carry bows. You know, dwarves live deep under the ground. You've got your centaurs and your trolls and different things like that. And there's a ton of books, both in and out of Appendix N, that have all those kinds of influences. And if you listen to that, I think it's called Monster. Is it Monster Man? The James Holloway's podcast. I want to say it's called Monster Man. But he does a great breakdown sometimes of like where some of these monsters come from, like the monsters that we see in D&D now, like where like the various like literary references where they originated at. Like, why does the troll have the long carrot-like nose and the black sunken eyes? Well, it was in this book, that Gary Gygax obviously read, and there was a picture in this version. It kind of looked like that, Yep. So these there's all these divergences of where all this stuff comes from. But he really goes deep into it. And another guy who does that is our friend Stu Horvath over on like he'll track down like the craziest like thread that goes all the way back, and all of a sudden I'm like sitting with rapt attention because I'm listening to like where the cloud giant came from. Like, well, why does it look the way it does in the Monster Manual? Hey, here's why, and here's a 20-minute explanation on it. So very, very.
I cannot wait to read his book.
Oh yeah. That's gonna be because he's not. It's not going to be like anybody else who's ever tackled this subject, because he has a much different view, I think, than a lot of the purists who write. Who have written books about the history of Dungeons and Dragons or RPGs in general. He's got he comes from a different place at a different time and really a completely different outlook. So I'm super excited to see like what his take on everything is going to be, because I know it's not going to read like anybody else. Not that anybody else is just wrong or different or bad or anything. It's just his is going to be an alternate take, an alternate look on the evolution of this hobby and just the history of these games. It's going to be cool.
Now, Gonzo. As for defining Gonzo, which I have already set the stage as being difficult. Again, I when I think of Gonzo, besides a blue Muppet shooting himself out of a cannon, I think of Hunter S. Thompson, because that's where the word kind of enters the modern vernacular. Is Thompson describing his journalism as Gonzo journalism, which just meant he was not just in the story, but a central part of the story. And because of all the various substances that Hunter S. Thompson ingested in his life, lots of weird, exaggerated details make their way into the narrative. Now, applying that to fantasy or science fiction or genre literature and gaming, how do you reconcile Thompson's kind of vision of Gonzo with what we typically would describe like a Gonzo sci-fi or fantasy story as?
Well, you're certainly right that that's where the term came from. It came from Hunter S. Thompson, describing his journalism in that fashion. It's the way that it kind of relates to fantasy or sci-fi. I think it really is all about like how things will unfold in a surreal or bizarre fashion. Like, not just a troll, it's a two-headed troll that squirts lasers out of its eyes and will vomit forth an ooze that can take multitudes of shapes. That's just way, way over the top.
Yeah.
And you might label that as like extreme weird fantasy, but hey, let's go a step farther with Gonzo, and the troll looks like Bart Simpson, or some other crazy pop culture reference, or it's wearing like a where's the beef t-shirt or something, like that's kind of where you get into Gonzo territory, where like it doesn't have to make sense as long as cool or interesting or will make somebody at the table kind of laugh. All of the adventure elements, all of the details about monsters and locations, especially, and rooms and scenarios, they're all wildly exaggerated. Or at least it's like kind of par for the course. And there's a lot of games that do that have those exact scenarios where all those qualities are in there. And again, pop culture references are often present in that. Some of them do it way better than others. Gonzo that's a wide scale. It could be really, really well, like Operation Unfathomable by Jason Schultes, fantastic. Or you can go kind of on the lower scale of things and have stuff that's not so good.
Yeah. Crafty Matt raises an interesting question in chat here. Would you consider Big Trouble in Little China to be Gonzo?
Oh, that's a really good question. So it's definitely weird adventure for sure. Wow, that's a great question. Let's see. Is it fantasy that unfolds in a surreal or bizarre fashion? Yes, absolutely. And it's really over the top because there are, why does Lopan need to marry two brides, and why do they have to have eyes? And it's like so far out there. Then he's got all the all the different hells that he will banish you to you're gonna go to the hell of of 1,000 tiny cuts, or the hell of boiling water, or whatever it is. I don't recall. And do things make sense, or are they just fun?
Right.
They kind of doesn't really make sense. I mean, there's all kinds of cool little bits of myth and stuff in there, and John Carpenter strings it together, and the actors do a great job of putting everything together. But all in all, like, Jack Burton just ends up killing him with one shot to the head, with a knife that bounces off a gong or something. He catches it and throws it back. So it's exaggerated, it's surreal. So yeah, I'm gonna say yeah, Matt. Like it is Gonzo. Like that's again very good question. Yeah, I'm gonna say Gonzo. But maybe it's straddling that line like Weird Adventure and Gonzo. It's a straddler. It's like Arduin. Arduin's a straddler.
Yeah. And I've actually had this conversation both with Crafty Matt and with Crossface. I don't know if Crossface is watching tonight, but they have both said to varying degrees that Dungeon Crawl Classics is Gonzo. I don't necessarily see it as Gonzo, at least not in like a pure sense. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think DCC? I know it lends itself to being played in a Gonzo fashion, but do you think the Dungeon Crawl Classics, as it shows up in the core book, is Gonzo?
No.
Okay.
No, I think far more weird fantasy. You can tell right from the get-go the aesthetic, the way it's written, the spells, the mighty deeds, the patron taint, everything, all the little things that make Dungeon Crawl Classics so cool, makes you feel like you're playing a game for the first time. That is all out of Appendix N, all weird fantasy. So the artwork and style, like guys like Kovacs and McDevitt and Stephen Pogue and all these guys that do all that great work, it lends it a very kind of dark feel, or like almost like a metal feel to it, like a heavy metal dungeon kind of feel to it. But that's all by design, and it really serves the material because it is, I mean, almost more than any other game, I think, it is weird fantasy. Yeah. Because it's definitely not Tolkienish, but it's definitely not like Chult. It's own thing. It is. As a matter of fact, I'll go out on a limb and say that it is the weird fantasy game. Especially a game that has heavy sword and sorcery influences and vibes. But yeah, I'd go so far as to say that it's the weird fantasy game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I agree with that. And part of what led me to that conclusion was I think it has the reputation of being Gonzo just from people who have heard secondhand things about DCC. But when I talked to Harley Stroh, he told me that almost the first thing out of his mouth about DCC was people think it's weirder than it actually is, and that when he and Joseph Goodman and Mike Curtis all get together and play DCC, they run it almost like it's Conan. So to me, and I know like there's a difference between how it appears, how it's written, and how it's run. But when it's run by the people who created it in a certain way, I think that tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the way it was intended to be run.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting that he says that they run it like Conan because if you give that a minute of thought, like yeah, that absolutely makes sense as far as like all the mechanics that are built into that game and like how deadly it is and especially the way magic works, like that makes so much sense. Um, yeah, I bet if you asked all those guys, I bet they would say weird fantasy. They like me when people call my games Gonzo, I like blanch at that. I'm like, it's not really. That's not really. That's not what I was shooting for. I was shooting more for the weird fantasy, the appendix N feel. But all right, people can play the game any way you want to. I just don't feel like it's very Gonzo at all. You're not gonna like step through a magic portal in a dungeon of mine and end up at a McDonald's,
Yeah.
or it's not gonna be like what was the old was it Dungeon Land and the Land Beyond the Magic Mirror. It was those old first edition AD&D modules where it's like Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
Nothing like that. Now that's Gonzo. I think that's and not weird fantasy at all.
And I think Gary Gygax wrote in a very Gonzo manner because when you play like Castle Greyhawk and you go down into the basement and you run into like the Star Trek cast, I mean, that's Gonzo.
No, absolutely. And that's just one of many things. Like he had, he would sometimes send characters to Mars or Barsoom.
Yeah.
And then they would be there with the ray gun, and of course you've got Barrier Peaks, which is really like the Titan that a lot of like modern weird fantasy like stands on the shoulders of, as far as like the way it's adapted to RPGs, because there have been an endless stream of imitators, myself included, who have riffed on and homaged that module. Everybody from myself with Howling Crater all the way down to like Anomalous Subsurface Environment, which is fantastic, by the way. And then Pathfinder did that whole crash ship scenario. And how many times have we seen that? It's like a lot of times. And it's really just interesting seeing people's different takes on that particular trope, of science fiction and fantasy mixed together. But like I said, Gary Gygax did it first as far as RPGs go. So that's a Titan, man. We're standing on those shoulders.
And when it comes to Gonzo, I want to kind of split Gonzo into two categories here, and I will call these in the manner that people split camp into high camp and low camp. I will call these high Gonzo and low Gonzo. So for me, high Gonzo is stuff that's very kind of artsy with its Gonzo. This is like Alejandro Jodorowsky and Zardoz to a certain extent. These are things that are, in the worst examples, very high on themselves with their Gonzo. And in the best example, you can tell that they're trying to say something kind of bigger with the weirdness that they're putting in there. It's not just weirdness for its own sake. It's weirdness to drive at a point that might be a little esoteric, but there's still something that they're trying to get at with the weirdness. And then there's low Gonzo, which would be stuff like Jolt, or now I can't think of another example of it, but stuff where, like the example you gave, a Bart Simpson troll wearing a "Where's the Beef" t-shirt. That would be like low Gonzo.
Right, very, very low Gonzo. Where would you put like David Lynch and all that?
I think I'd put him in the high Gonzo category. I know sometimes he'll dip down into low, but I feel like it's all in service to to creating a usually an uneasy environment, just to kind of, I guess, further the discomfort of his main characters, because that seems to be a very a Lynchian thing to do, is to make his main characters as uncomfortable as possible.
Suffer, suffer, suffer. Yeah. Sometimes he puts him in a demonic lodge for 25 years. um, yeah, yeah. So if we're talking off RPGs now, and we're going into to movies, Jodorowsky for sure.
Mhm.
I mean, if you've ever seen Holy Mountain, I'm assuming you have.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. If you've ever seen Holy Mountain, like what? Like what? Yeah, the first couple times you even watch it, like what did I just watch? Like what is even happening? You have to watch. It's one of those movies you have to watch like 8 times before you start to understand like what he's going for. I got to read a book. I got to look at 4 or 5 articles on the internet. Like I got to think about it for a month. Then I might start to glean like, oh, that's what he was saying.
Yep.
This movie, and that would definitely be icon. So, yeah, definitely.
Now that we're talking about movies, there's actually I feel like one exception that is what I will call high-low Gonzo, and that would be the Coen brothers.
Huh. Oh, well, like what specifically?
So I'm thinking of The Big Lebowski. I feel
Okay.
like The Big Lebowski is a very Gonzo movie.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
But the weirdness in that movie, some of it's there for its own kind of weird sake, but it's also there again to create an environment, to replicate the noir environment where the main character is completely in over his head.
Oh, yeah, yeah, well, yeah. No, and I think all that is very much by design.
Mhm.
So I get it. I can see why you would call that high, but yet, kind of high Gonzo, but kind of like sneaking down back behind the bleachers to have a smoke.
Yeah.
Kind of, kind of
Oh Brother Where Art Thou is very similar in that regard.
see that. Both of those movies masterpieces, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah, the Coen Brothers in general. They do a lot of stuff like that. Like, did you ever see A Simple Man?
No, I haven't seen A Simple Man.
So it's a great film, but for me, the best part of that movie is like the first, like 10 minutes of it, and then like of course the ending. But watch that first 10 minutes. If you don't watch any other part of it, watch that first 10 minutes with the Dybbuk. It's very very it's an interesting story, but. Yeah, Coen Brothers. I didn't think about that. Like I was thinking, like we were going to go into like Army of Darkness territory, because Army of Darkness is one of those things where like it's very creative, it's very busy and exciting, but there's a lot of stuff in there that does poke at pop culture. With the skeletons doing the whole Larry Moe and Curly thing and poking the eyes and.
Yep.
All the little jokes, and it's half comedy, half like horror.
Mm-hmm.
The Klaatu Barada Nikto reference with the Necronomicon, all that stuff. That's all very, in my opinion, is very Gonzo.
Mm-hmm.
It's not horror, it's not so much comedy. It's just them kind of just going way off in the crazy territory.
Yeah, honestly, I think pre-Spider-Man Sam Raimi is very Gonzo, and I'd put him on. Saying someone is low Gonzo, by the way, is not me trying to insult them, just so everyone out there knows. I'm not saying that a low Gonzo work is worse than a high Gonzo work. Because like if we were going to categorize Big Trouble in Little China, that's low Gonzo. But
but a genius piece of cinema.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely enjoyable, eminently rewatchable 1,000 times. You can watch that twice a year, every year. If you had the mind to.
Specifically, even like beyond back to Sam Raimi, even beyond the Evil Dead trilogy, which is very Gonzo. I don't know when you last watched Darkman.
Oh yeah,
but that movie. That is one of the most deeply weird and fascinating movies of all time. The fact that it began life as a shadow adaptation is interesting. Okay. The whole notion of like the visions that Liam Neeson is seeing throughout that whole movie, it's very Gonzo. The way that he interacts with the world once his face gets melted off.
So yeah. It's another one I never really thought about though, like that. So, yeah, very cool. Yeah,
I made my wife watch Darkman with me not too terribly long ago. She's a huge Liam Neeson fan.
Not anymore.
And so I was like, let's watch this movie. It has Liam Neeson in it. He's the main character. It's, Sam Raimi who made Spider-Man. And, it's kind of a dark take on a superhero movie. And she's like, okay. And we watch it. Now, I almost forgot how weird it was. I knew this movie was weird. Honestly, I really just wanted her to see the elephant scene, but
But my favorite, I think that's everyone's favorite scene in the whole movie. That's like the quote that I always hear when somebody brings up Darkman.
yeah. But I was watching that movie, and I love Darkman. Darkman's a fun movie, even considering just how like bizarre and macabre it is.
Yeah.
But I mean, she fell asleep during it. I was just like, oh yeah, this movie's probably not for you.
And it had its own Marvel comic for several issues. There was the Darkman comic.
Yep.
Not good. Not good. Not good.
And
what
Joe,
other?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say what other kind of veering it back towards RPGs. Like what other Gonzo RPGs like have you consumed or have you played or read or just picked up?
So we've already mentioned that Dungeon Crawl Classics is more in the weird fantasy camp, but I would say that Mutant Crawl Classics is very much in the Gonzo camp, especially when you get people like Skeeter who decide to mix DCC and MCC together and throw you in a, for all intents and purposes, a haunted server room.
So I feel like Gamma World and Mutant Crawl Classics both, I think they're kind of like post-apocalyptic games that have the reins completely thrown off.
Yeah.
So they're one of those straddlers, I think. I think they straddle the line between like weird sci-fi and then complete Gonzo. Like Jim Wampler, he wrote a module called, it's like the flying head of Atos, or the head of something. Atos is in the title, but it's all about you're members of this wasteland tribe or Glowburn jungle tribe, and the usual, you're raiding and you're fighting. Anyways, there's this giant like head from Zardoz that you can pilot around and whatnot, and so that has, it's again very surreal in the fact that you're like a caveman almost, coming out of the post-apocalyptic era, but then all of a sudden you're in this giant stone head and you're flying this crazy wasteland. Yeah. It was a really good module, but again, it has that pop culture reference to it. But it's not like with like a wink and a nod. It's just a cool riff on an idea. He's obviously, it's there for nostalgia's sake. But it's a cool, it's just a really cool mechanism, a thing that your characters can do. Because who's not going to forget that one game where you get to fly around the stone head and blast monsters? Like nobody will forget the cool idea.
Mm-hmm. And another one, while we're on the subject of Crawl Classics compatible, our mutual friend David Beatty, Weird Frontiers, I feel like the thing that really differentiates it from Deadlands is that it has more opportunity for Gonzo, because, you can't play a luchador in Deadlands, but you can in Weird Frontiers. You can't play a a displaced time traveling Sin Eater in Deadlands, but again, you can in Weird Frontiers.
Very much so, yeah. That's just a great, in the vein of all the Crawl Classics, all the Goodman stuff, all the stuff that's derived from DCC. It's probably my favorite, of all. And David, you could tell that everything that he put into it was genuine. Everything that he put into it was something that he wanted to see or that he wanted to play. It really is just, it's just a masterwork of like modern fun gaming. I played it last year with him. I played a game with him last year. I played Luchador, actually. Actually, we were all Luchadors. That was a cool thing. And it was kind of like a Hellboy in Mexico meets From Dusk Till Dawn sort of thing. And we got to fight vampires, and we got to, come up with the names for our own moves and do all these dynamic like flips. It was a crazy off the rails game. We had a blast with it. We actually like clapped afterwards. Like that's how good it was. Like it was just a really, really fun time. So Weird Frontiers, man, is just, man. I mean, you could kill somebody with that book on its own.
Yes, you can.
But man, what a game! What a game that is. I didn't really consider it Gonzo until you brought up those points, because it does have a surreal bit to it. But I would call that, I would rank that more up into like the funner Gonzo, rather than more exploitative Gonzo that some works kind of go down into. What do you think about Spelljammer being a Gonzo property?
Yeah, I mean, I can see it. I can see, because you have, I feel like Gonzo necessitates a mix of at least two genres together that don't necessarily go together. And with Spelljammer, you have fantasy and space opera, which have gone together, but the way that Spelljammer does it, they don't fit quite so coherently together like they do in, say, Star Wars. Or, John Carter, I feel like, is also a mix of fantasy and space opera. But the other thing about Gonzo is the two things have to almost clash with each other. It's kind of intentionally gaudy in that way. So I do feel like there's a little bit of a clash of styles between, it's a space opera, but the ships are ships. And everyone's, fantasy. So yeah, I do consider Spelljammer to be Gonzo.
Yeah, because you think about all those points, yes, but then like you start getting into like the guts of Spelljammer, and like all the little things. Like there's the orcs are the space orcs are just called Skro, which are the orcs backwards. And there's all this, all the weird, the Zodar and the Neogi and all this weird stuff, and the was it Phlogiston between the stars, and there's all that. It's very unusual. But if I call Spelljammer Gonzo, do I also have to say that like Dark Sun is Gonzo? And when I say that out loud, like I don't feel like Dark Sun is really Gonzo, but it's got some crazy stuff going on in there. Hey. Like Dark Sun comes out. Okay, so like nobody wants to play humans. Let's make half dwarves and half giants. Well, hey, psionics didn't really work in first edition, but hey, second edition, let's give everyone psionics. Let's make the halflings cannibals. Let's make the world is inhospitable, like a Mad Max kind of thing, but the rulers of every city are dragons, and you're just like, what? Like, what are you talking about, man? Like, it's just so like, and the elves are evil, and there's all this, craziness going around. It's almost like they take every trope that you expect from like a, from like a Tolkien-esque kind of thing, and they completely invert them, So yeah, I don't know that I would call Dark Sun Gonzo, but I certainly, because it doesn't feel that way to me, but it kind of all the same points that I'm making about Spelljammer. So it's like, if Spelljammer's Gonzo, I might have to say, like realistically, like logically, wouldn't Dark Sun be kind of, Gonzo as well? I don't know.
I'm also struggling to call Dark Sun Gonzo, and part of it's the way that I run Dark Sun. I tend to run Dark Sun in a way that's very, I guess you would call it grim Dark Sun. Like, everything is very oppressive, and just like the weight of the world is constantly following characters around as they're traveling through this waste. I feel like Gonzo has a sense of oddball fun to it.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah,
if you can tell that the characters are very uncomfortable, like in a David Lynch movie, there's a lot of just kind of madcap zaniness to everything.
yeah. I think you're right. It's a very good point. I think that Dark Sun would fall more into like a grim dark
Yeah.
or like dark fantasy, like I don't know, like Lamentations of the Flame Princess or Zweihander or what is it, Shadows of the Demon Lord?
Mm.
That grim dark stuff, um, where it's like low magic, but high, like like in Zweihander, it's like really easy to die,
Yeah.
like it's like one of those, and that's kind of like one of the things with like the grim dark stuff is like yeah, you can face off with that guy or run away, but if you face off with him, you might get wounded and then later die from that wound. Like
Yep.
yeah. So it does kind of have that. It does kind of have that element to it for
Mm.
sure. But that that's another thing though is that dark fantasy, that grim dark stuff. That is not Gonzo.
No.
Like we just talked about Lamentations of the Flame Princess and all that stuff. None of that is Gonzo. So yeah, great point. Dark Sun would not fall into the Gonzo category.
Mm. Yeah, I definitely there's a certain tone that has to be struck to kind of meet the categorization of Gonzo, like we discussed. And it looks like Orcus Dorcas, Scott here in chat, agrees with us and said essentially the same thing as us at the same time. So,
What's up, Scott?
but
Yeah, I mean, Gonzo again has to unfold in that kind of surreal or bizarre fashion. There's the pop culture elements. At least for me, that's what it defines. A lot of people would say that doesn't have to be involved, but for me, it's like almost integral. That there's that pop culture feels to it, and of course the wildly exaggerated, locations, monsters, creatures, NPCs, along with stuff doesn't have to make sense as long as it's fun or it plays at the table.
yeah, Gonzo. There's this sense of manic joy to everything Gonzo related, and when you get too straight faced or too serious, even if there's weird stuff going on, you leave the realm of Gonzo. So, like, I mean, Dark Sun's a good example of that. So is Warhammer, so is Zweihander, The Witcher, and anything where your characters are mostly like scowly, world weary
Yeah,
warriors and like I've got a tragic back. You're not gonna have someone. The man with no name is not gonna show up in a Gonzo story.
well, he might, but he won't be any man with no name that you recognize.
Right? Yeah. And on a completely different subject, going back to just like examples of Gonzo games, Crafty Matt mentions a good one here: Ultraviolet Grasslands.
Yep.
By Luca Reyes, if I remembered how to pronounce that name correctly, from when he was on the show years and years ago. All of his stuff is pretty Gonzo, including Witchburner, including Ultraviolet Grasslands.
Yeah, it's psychedelic heavy metal.
Yeah.
It's like you're playing it. It's like you're playing a game of Mandy. Like it's like Cosmos Panatos is your DM. It's very very again psychedelic, and it has a heavy metal vibe to it. At least that's the vibe. I've never played Ultraviolet Glasslands. I've just read the book, but that is definitely the vibe that I get from it. It's very similar to like was it Into the Odd? Kind of the sort of a feel, I think.
Yep. Now, to ask kind of an odd question here, I know we've kind of laid out some examples, so, and this might even be a difficult question. If you had the option right now, like, hey, we're going to play a game, do you want to play a weird fantasy game or a Gonzo game? Which one would you choose?
Oh, weird fantasy. And again, it's the stuff that I like to write. It's the stuff that I almost always end up buying. Third party stuff, especially DCC stuff. I'm not one of those guys that buys every DCC product, but when I see products by like guys like Harley or Brendan or Michael Curtis, guys that I either have played with or know. These are creators that I really enjoy their work. So, and I always know that like if I get an adventure and it has Marzio's name on it, I know it's going to be awesome. Like the Star Madden was just like chef's kiss. It's just so good, and that's another one of those weird fantasy games. So I'm picking up that DCC stuff. I'm picking up for all the same reasons I picked up like all the Arduin stuff. I picked up all the Planescape stuff, and I like all that Monty Cook Games stuff. What is it? It's like Strange. They did a bunch of work on Planescape after Zeb Cook. They did Numenera, and the new one. It's called, what is the one with the comet? It's awesome. Planebreaker. Yeah, all that stuff. Extreme weird fantasy, but not Gonzo at all. It's just so strange and weird and different than your dad's D&D. Those guys, they're creating worlds and building gamescapes that, Monty Cook Games is like they do the coolest stuff, man. They really, it's like an idea factory over there where they got like Monty Cook, they got Bruce Cordell, it's like Sean Reynolds, all these guys that were like killers in second and early third edition D&D. Went off and they're doing their own thing and they're just murdering it. Like it's just amazing. But some of the stuff they do, like that Planebreaker especially, like I got that and got it home and finally kicked back with that. And I thought, well, I'll look at this for 10 minutes. And it was like an hour and a half later, I'm like, this is like just a source book of ideas. This is fantastic. So
I'd have to agree with you. As you mentioned, there is an element of psychedelia that is necessary in Gonzo, and I have always had trouble digesting psychedelia. I'll just come out and say it. I'm too square for psychedelic stuff. The like Pink Floyd is as psychedelic as I can go, to be perfectly honest. It's a me problem. Like I know I'm just not that guy. Like and this is like a deep, dark fantasy confession, especially for someone who purports to be an old school gamer. I even have trouble with Moorcock. Moorcock a lot of times gets too out there for me, and maybe I need to expand my mind a little more, either figuratively or literally. But I always kind of trip up whenever something seems a little too psychedelic, and I'm just like, I can't. This isn't a route that I can follow you down. So for me, I think weird fantasy all the way.
If you're having trouble with Moorcock, actually skip the Elric stuff at first and go to. He wrote some books. Gosh, I'm trying to remember the name. It was like King Brass. Mm-hmm. Because he has the Eternal Champion thing kind of the same way, like there's Conan and Solomon Kane and Cull and Bram McMorn and all these different guys are really the same guy. He kind of has the same thing going on with his Eternal Champion, where he's got all these different it's King Brass. It's like I'm trying to think of the name. It's like Corwin or I can't. God, man, I'm losing my geek cred because I can't remember it. I can't remember the hero's name, but look up that book King Brass. There's some cool stuff. That whole series about that hero is great, and it could be a primer that you could go into, and then hey, now I can try out Elric. And if you can't read the Elric books, try listening to them on audiobook.
Yeah,
I think Neil Gaiman is actually the guy who reads the audiobooks, so that might be like an easier primer for you if you really want to check out the weirdness of Moorcock.
Mm-hmm. Is it Hawk Moon? Is that who you were thinking of?
Yes. Again, I lost my geek cred. Yeah, Hawk Moon.
There you go. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, sorry, Scott. Yeah, those Hawk Moon books are great. Mm-hmm. a primer that you can read. It's like Elric Light.
Yeah.
Not quite as bizarre as the Vanishing Tower and all that other stuff. Yeah, check out Hogmoon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, I might just have to. I have the Elric like big collection audiobook. I might need to just go back and try it again. This time I will skip the introductory story by Neil Gaiman because I think Neil has some kind of dark associations with the time in life where he read the Elric stories, which really kind of, by the time I finished his introduction, I was just like, well, that was a bummer. And then we go into Elric, and I'm just like, I don't know that I feel like reading this anymore. So I
Is that the
might
one? Is that the one where the young writer kills himself?
Yes.
Yeah, that was it was a bummer. But listen, he's framing things in the way that he found, that he found Moorcock for the first time, and he's framing it all in a story, and he does what he does. It is a bummer, but it's still a pretty good story. It's just not what you want to read, maybe not what you want to listen to right as you're going into this epic story about an anti-hero. When I think about it, you're right. That is a weird comparison. But again, it might be like Jodorowsky, where I need to, think about it for a while, read some articles, study up in some books, before I really understand what he was probably doing there. So, yeah, it is what it is.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, it's really interesting how weird fantasy, like I said, is it's the influence on D&D and therefore on the rest of like fantasy role playing.
Mm-hmm.
But Tolkien style fantasy is what caught on as like, this is what fantasy means in the zeitgeist, like to modern people's minds. But D&D is also allowed to coexist alongside it. And so you have these two very different concepts of fantasy that coexist with each other and borrow from each other. And a lot of people try to conflate them, but I found people who have a very purist Tolkien mindset, when they first get into D&D or, DCC even more so, or OSE or something like that, when they first encounter that weird fantasy stuff, they almost feel like it's not fantasy anymore. So it's interesting how these two things coexist with each other.
Yeah, I mean, Tolkien. Tolkien is so that before there was D&D. Gary obviously read Tolkien, but I don't know that it was necessarily that big of an influence on him,
right?
As some of the other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a big influence on the culture, because Tolkien wrote those books, and then they were kind of forgotten for a minute, and then in the '60s they come back. They're like, it's like a big deal. Led Zeppelin is singing about the Misty Mountains, and there's all this again. That cultural zeitgeist is emerging. And again, it might not have been as big an influence on Gary as some people would think. And I don't know. This is just conjecture. But it was a big deal for people who were into fantasy, or people who were discovering fantasy in the mid to late '60s, going on into the early '70s, and we get D&D. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, who knows? Who knows what the truth is? With that, I mean, I'm sure a guy like John Peterson or Stu or somebody like that could school us on the exact details on all of that, but I don't know. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also, it's interesting to see someone like Ralph Bakshi, who was very Gonzo in his filmmaking and his influences, and probably more of if he were reading fantasy, it would be more Michael Moorcock or stuff like that. Try his take on Tolkien. So you almost have a weird fantasy Tolkien movie in a lot of ways.
Well, then he does Wizards,
yeah,
right? And then you get there is a real kind of definite weird fantasy, almost Gonzo feel to that.
Mm-hmm. I would full on classify Wizards as Gonzo just because of all the like Nazi stuff in it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Bakshi and Von Bode and all those incredible artists, man, they were products of their time, but that it's got some very disturbing imagery in Wizards. There's a reason why it's not celebrated, today. Obviously, it's not something we're showing our kids for sure. I'm not going back. I've seen it, but I'm not going back and rewatching it the way that I'm watching, like, I don't know, like heavy metal or something like that. Like I'm not revisiting that. Like I'm not watching that like I would watch like Jaws or Dirty Harry or any of the other stuff from that era.
Mm-hmm. Now, Fire and Ice, on the other hand.
Hey, Fire and Ice is great, man. You can't put that down.
Fire and Ice is for the whole family.
No,
so, it's not. But
quick story about that. When I was a kid, my parents took me to the video store. You can pick one thing, but it has to be a cartoon. So I'm looking around. All the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe tapes have been rented out. We're there late. Nothing. They got like My Little Pony or whatever, or an episode of G.I. Joe I've seen like 1,000 times. So I'm wandering around like dejected because there's obviously there's no Star Wars or anything like that because that stuff hadn't even been out on video. That wasn't even, you couldn't even get that at the video store at the time. So I'm just like walking around dejected, and there I see it in my sight up on the shelf, Fire and Ice, and I'm like, ooh, I'll take that. And my parents didn't blink an eye because it was a cartoon. We get it home. And it's like, whatever, 5 minutes in, and there's boobs, and, there's all this other stuff going on. And they're like, what did you rent? Like, what the? And I was like, I don't know, but leave it on. It was crazy, man. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fire and Ice. Man, I haven't thought about that movie in a long time.
Oh, man. That movie is great.
Hey, I got a question for you. Would you count Planescape as weird fantasy or Gonzo? Because Planescape is, as we talked about this before, is out of all the settings for D&D, it's my favorite.
I would hesitate to call it Gonzo because there's a lot of weirdness, but I feel like a lot of the weirdness fits together because, like Sigil is the Mos Eisley of the gods.
Right.
So, like, everything there is kind of on the same playing field, the same level. I don't feel like you're going to run into anything super out of the ordinary in Sigil or in Planescape because everything's out of the ordinary. And also, it is kind of taken pretty seriously. I don't see Planescape as having like a manic, goofy grin on its face with the stuff that it does. It does some weird stuff, but again, it's all kind of treated very seriously and treated as like, this is the way things work and everything follows a certain logic and, it adheres to a certain set of rules and order and, obviously the Lady of Pain enforces all of that. But I think that I can't necessarily call Planescape Gonzo.
You're 1,000% right. It is absolutely not Gonzo. I would almost even... So, it's definitely weird fantasy, but it's not a straddler. Like, Arduin is a bit of a straddler
right.
between a weird fantasy and Gonzo. And I love Arduin too, but Arduin had much more of like a pop culture-ish sort of nod and wink sometimes to, it was deadly on one hand, and it didn't make sense in a lot of areas. It was just fun to play. But at the same time, there was a lot of lore, and there was a lot of like really cool like connected bits with Arduin. And I think Planescape's like origins, at least in like, maybe not in the way that like Zeb Cook conceived it. I don't think its origins belong in Arduin, but I do think there is a kind of a nod and a wink to Arduin with the way Planescape feels, especially with the way that later authors, maybe guys like Cordell and Monty Cook especially, kind of picked up the reins when they were writing Planescape. Like, you can tell that those guys, at least I think, that they enjoyed Arduin at some point. You know, that they had read those little brown books and that they had enjoyed them. And when I think about Planescape and like where it fits in the weird fantasy Gonzo, there's nothing Gonzo about Planescape to me. But I was looking at this, you know, we were looking at Dark Sun and Spelljammer, and I thought, well, what about Planescape? You know, like, what if, does that fit in any of those molds? And I don't think it does. I think it's just a super well thought out and super opportunistic and just really well put together campaign setting. I mean, really, the options are limitless. Not just Sigil. That's just one tiny part of Planescape. Once you Great Wheel and you can go really anywhere in the multiverse. I mean, all bets are off. You've got the factions, you've got the gods, you've got all that crazy stuff going on in between, and like the astral and ethereal. Like there's some cool stuff going on in that setting. Like it really is, the door is blown wide open, and you can do anything, you can go anywhere if you have the right key or the right access, or you know, you have the right adventure hook. Like I'm stunned that has not been picked up in modern times and given its due justice. I mean, on one hand, I'm kind of like happy that it hasn't, because not that new things ruin old things for me, but like I would really like to see it have justice be done to it. And I don't think that's, you know, with the folks who handled Spelljammer and Dragonlance and so, not that I'm putting that down, it's just not my cup of tea. And I would rather see Planescape be presented in a way that's more my cup of tea. But that's just, listen, that's just me. And here's my wish list, you know. But in the absence of that, we have stuff like Planebreaker, and we have stuff like Numenera and the Strain. All that stuff, the Monte Cook Games people are doing. It's all like a progression from their work, more or less, at least in like a feel to it that Planescape had, you know. That's where those guys made a lot of their bones, was doing all that really cool Planescape stuff, you know. I mean, what a job. Like, what an opportunity to get to work in that setting. Like, so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the trouble with Planescape and why it hasn't really made an appearance, like with 5e or anything more modern, it requires a certain level of reverence and, I think, self-seriousness, and kind of taking the world and the game and the lore seriously. And there's not really a desire to do that within the WotC ecosystem. I mean, we've seen the way that they've handled Ravenloft. That's just not how they make games there. So to take on something like Planescape, it would be super watered down Planescape. And I mean, even just like the task of putting all that stuff together in Planescape. Zeb Cook talked about how stressful that process was to build the world that is Planescape. I don't think anyone wants to replicate that, especially with what, you know, like modern expectations from Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast would be now.
Yeah, I mean, man, what a concept, what a delivery. I've said it before, like, Zeb Cook's writing and world building combined with like Tony DiTerlizzi's art, it creates this perfect, like, ethereal, strange world with Planescape. You get that box set for the first time. I remember getting it in the was it Barnes Noble? No, it was what was the other one? Let's see, Walden Books. Getting it at Walden Books, and you know, popping the shrink and pulling that off, and it's got like, you know, there's like 4 books, and all these maps and all this crazy stuff inside. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, this is a lot. But then you're just reading it, and it's all so cool, and it all makes sense. But at the same time, it's hey, it's D&D, but man, it is just like something completely new, all on its own.
Yep.
We got that, and it was just, I mean, it's what for that or have come afterwards can really compare to that first Planescape experience, because it was that perfect pairing of Zeb Cook and Tony DiTerlizzi. Like, it was, I mean, talk about two talents, immense talents that were just perfect for collaborating with each other, but also like perfect for the material. Like it's just to me, it's the best. And I love Greyhawk. I love Forgotten Realms. I love Dark Sun, Ravenloft. I even like some of the weirder ones like Alchemy and like Red Steel and some of these really kind of offbeat,
Yeah.
And then weirder stuff like I love Hyperborea, like Telanian's Hyperborea. I think that's just a fantastic game setting, but just that Planescape, man, that's just man, what a perfect product.
Yeah, and this is completely a field of the topic, but that's a feeling that has not been replicated in a long time. Is this the feeling that you get from reading through those old box sets of you open this box and there's an entire world inside that is essentially given over to you. I even got that reading through like the Dark Sun box set, the original, the first one that came out. When I read the material in it, I was just like, okay, this is a world in and of itself that's already been presented to me. If I want to add stuff, I can, but I don't feel like I need to, unless unless I get the desire to some point down the road. That's something that I want to replicate with the stuff that I'm working on. Like that's for the stuff that I'm working on with Nighthaven. I want to, once it's ready, have a boxed set for Nighthaven that gives people that same sense of Ryan's given me this complete playground that I can play in, and if I can add on to it if I want to, but there's already tons of cool stuff in here, and there's other stuff that I'm working on that I hope will replicate that feeling. So I'd like to see that come back to gaming.
Yeah. I get that every now and then with certain projects, but it's on a smaller scale. Like I picked up this really cool, speaking of weird fantasy, that kind of borders on Gonzo, way more weird fantasy. But I picked up this supplement a couple years ago called Genial Jack. Have you heard of this?
I haven't.
So again, it's like this crazy cosmic space whale. I can't. That's not even doing it justice. But there's a city inside of a giant, like titanically sized whale,
Mm-hmm.
and it sounds like this kind of crazy bogus concept. But this writer Jonathan Newell, the way that he frames it and the way that he writes it, and all the little interesting bits that he puts into it, it was like the first product in a while that I picked up to where I was like, oh, this is a whole campaign. It's a whole mini setting set inside of a whale, which I never would have thought of, on my own, or would have thought that I needed. But as soon as I started reading it, like, where has this been all my life? This is amazing. So yeah, I see it sometimes on smaller levels, but not like it was in those. When you open up those, you get that you're taking the top off that box set for the first time after popping the shrink, and you're seeing all the there's maps in there. There's like 3 books. There's just all this cool stuff in there, and there's a player's guide, and a DM's guide, a monster book. You're like, oh my god, you spread it all out. You're like, this is so much. Like this is fantastic. I could play this for years. And then they start to put out all the supporting material for it, and next thing you know, you're hooked. So, I wish there was a return to stuff like that. We get it with stuff occasionally. I'm telling you, man, that Plane Breaker book by Monty Cook Games, and I don't know those guys. I'm just a fan of this book. It was really it made me feel like that again. Like I was like, oh, there's just so much in here that's interesting and stuff I could pull from my own campaign. Even if I never play a Planebreaker campaign or a game, there's so much stuff in there that I could pull from my own home table, and do. Yeah, so it's just I wish there were more products like that gave me that feeling,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
that jazz where you're pumped after paging through it. So.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm sure I'm probably shooting too high, which is why Nighthaven is not the first thing I'm going to release. because I do want that to be a box set that evokes kind of that old box set feeling. But
Hell yeah, dude! Bring that.
and I with the box sets that I want to do, I'm hoping to kind of replicate what OSE has with the box sets of digest sized books, because I think
Mm-hmm.
that's people like having the big meaty tome on their shelf, but when it comes to what's easy to carry around, digest size.
What's easy to play with at the table?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
So as we're kind of running up on our time here, of course, this year we are both going to North Texas RPG Convention again. Things are still being scheduled, so we don't know precisely when our games are going. I do know that all three of mine have been approved. Have yours been approved?
They have all been approved, and all are happening. I think at 9 a.m. They all. I'm doing all morning games every day that the con is going. So slip in there and get on in on some dungeon crawling goodness.
I believe I'm running a 9 a.m. game on Thursday, but either Friday or Saturday, I can hopefully slip into one of those. But my games, for anyone out there who is hoping to join one of my games, all three are going to be in Nighthaven, my custom made campaign setting. The titles that you're looking for are The Rot Runs Deep, which will be a sewer crawl with some mad science-y twists in there. Then there will be Hard Time, which will be a prison adventure.
All right.
And then the last one is called Judgment Day, or not Judgment, Day of Reckoning. And that one will be a mass combat battle scenario that I am running on Saturday night, which will wrap up right before the midnight auction.
Nice. Right on. Oh, I'm running. Guess what are we doing? I'm running Three Curses for Sister Saren, which is an adventure that Mike Lee wrote for Planet X Games, and it's a low level, very very sword and sorcery game. I don't want to give away too much. The module's not out yet, so I don't give away too much. But I had a lot of fun running it and playtest this last year, and it was pretty successful with the people who played it. They really seemed to like it. I'm doing Jungle Tomb of the Mummy Bride, the Lost level, which was the new level that we wrote for my very first dungeon. When we did the DCC version, we added another level. So that one has seemed, people seem to enjoy that one. It's a good 4-hour block of time. And then I'm running Escape from Skullcano Island, Ruins of the Mecha Kaiju,
Nice.
where you explore the ruins of this old rusting hulk of the jungle on your way to fortune and glory. So that I'll probably throw in like a pickup game of like Glimmering Crypt of the Iron King or Howling Crater or something like that.
Mm.
I usually do 1 or 2 pickup games. But yeah, I'm really hoping to. That's all I'm doing, and then I'm playing the rest of the time. So I'm really hoping to get in on your game, and I want to get on Alex Kammer's fantasy horror game that he's running. And there's a couple other. I think Taco John's running a couple games. I definitely want to hook up and game with him. Maybe Jay Shields is running Aliens. We could get in on that. I don't know. We'll see. There's so many good games. So many top quality folks at that con. So you really can't go wrong.
I'm also hoping to be able to bring some recording equipment with me this time and maybe do some very loose, informal late night live streams while I'm there and seeing if I can grab a couple guests. I have this, and I don't even know if this would be feasible. I have this grand vision of getting everyone in the IPU drunk and on a live stream at the same time, but I don't even know if everyone drinks. So,
well, you 2/5 of us are going to be out, but I think maybe you could get Delaney and Ian and I in there to do a few things, but some of those guys they don't partake anymore. So,
Yeah, fair enough.
but listen, if the Black Sabbath is playing on the boom box at 11 p.m. and Matt Roberts is buying shots and we're all three sheets to the wind, I'm not saying anything. So yeah, I'm to tell you right now, if you catch me like that, I'm down.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. So that's going to do it for tonight's episode, unfortunately. There's never enough time when you're on the show. I wish I could go another hour with you, but unfortunately there's never enough time.
Always a good time.
All right, well, that is going to do it for tonight's episode of Rollin' Bones. Next week, we are going to have Greg, the creator of Ares Chronicles, on here to talk all about his games. You guys have seen him on, Basic Experts show. He's kicking around on Twitter all the time. He's got some fantastic games out there, so we're going to be talking all about the stuff that he creates. That'll all be next week. And also, as a reminder to everyone, we are still in the thick of this kind of battle for the soul of gaming, as it were. Just because WotC has, kind of backed up a little bit doesn't mean we're not done getting everything that we can get out of role-playing. So with that in mind, I am still #RPGorilla, and I hope all of you guys will join me in that when discussing gaming on Twitter or, various other social medias, because, that's what we are. We're gaming insurgents at this point, fighting for the freedom to not be chained to our computers when it comes to running role-playing games, I guess. It seems like that's not too much to ask for, but, you never can tell.
Nobody has a license on your imagination.
Exactly. Our creativity should remain unshackled. So yeah, that's still going on. I'm still going to be silly about that stuff. So until next time, guys, whether you rolled a 1 or a 20, I'm so glad that you rolled your bones with me, Ryan Howard, with Levi Combs here from Planet X Games. Hope you guys will buy every single book that he has out there, and I hope you guys will come to North Texas and see us. And I will see you guys next time.
Let's play some games.
Absolutely.